Texas Film Roundup program not only provides Texans with free digitization services for their films and videotapes, but also preserves and shares their uniquely Texas stories via our website, texasarchive.org. There you can watch more than 5,000 videos contributed by individuals and institutions from across the state. Archive Dive highlights the people and organizations behind the collections on view at texasarchive.org. With support from Humanities Texas, we will chat with contributors about their materials and discover more information about those videos and the Texans who made them. Tonight, we are watching films from the Rosenberg Library Collection. Located in Galveston, the Rosenberg Library is the oldest Texas public library in continuous operation. TAMI was lucky enough to partner with the Rosenberg Library when we took the Texas Film Roundup to the Oleander City back in 2016, and I was there for that roundup, and we had a great time. Joining us for our dive into the institution's fascinating video collection tonight is the Rosenberg Senior Archivist and Special Collections Manager, Sean McConnell. We are talking to Sean via Zoom. Good evening, Sean.
Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And as a heads up, if anyone from the audience has questions for Sean during our conversation, Team TAMI is monitoring the comments section. But before we get started with tonight's program, Sean, just tell us a little about the materials that the Rosenberg Library shared with TAMI for the Texas Film Roundup.
Sure. So, as you said, we had this film roundup about 5 or 6 years ago. It was a great popular event here at the library. For us as an institution, as well as the city, a lot of people were able to drop off their home movies and gift you all to digitize. So that was a great experience. And we really didn't know exactly what we had in our film collection. It's not a huge collection, but we didn't have the means to play a lot of those films for some time. And a lot of what we'll see and a lot of what we have are productions made in the 1950s through the 1970s that were sponsored by the Galveston Chamber of Commerce and produced by KHOU or other stations in Houston. We also have some home movies showing Galveston in the 1930s or in the 1960s during Hurricane Carla especially. A cool one is the beauty pageant, the international pageant of Pulchritude that we had here in the 1920s and early 1930s. A rare find of a silent movie. That's definitely was a surprise for us. So it runs the gamut. We do have mainly these productions for Galveston, some tourist productions and commercial productions from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, as well as these home movies and some surprises as well.
Because you say, it's not a particularly big collection, like you said, but there is some great stuff in there. But is the Rosenberg typically collecting moving images?
No, it's not something we really get very often. And to be honest, those films were probably not given to the archive. They were probably collected by the reference and adult services departments or used for promotional things that happened at the library and then ended up here as time went on. So we're happy to accept films. It's not something that we normally have. We do have a large manuscript collection, photograph collection. The films haven't been as highlighted in our collecting, but it's still great to have.
Yeah.
Yes,
it's not part of your usual acquisition process.
No.
But I thought we might begin tonight's programming with a brief introduction to Galveston for anyone who hasn't been lucky enough to visit themselves. Produced as a public service by Houston's KHOU TV, this 1960s tourism film explains why Galveston is America's wish you were here city. Let's roll the clip.
They call this Treasure Island, and that it certainly is. What a wonderful vacation spot. Be just great to live here. Miles of beautiful beach, warm Gulf waters, mild climate the year round. There's always plenty to do. Fishing? Well, they've got all kinds. There are 51 kinds of edible fish to catch. Deep sea in the Gulf of Mexico, in the bay, out of the surf, off piers, the beaches, well, they're just great. The beach beachfront is almost a city within itself. Fine hotels and motels, apartment houses, a variety of splendid restaurants and amusement places. Galveston's a beautiful city. Wide boulevards, esplanades covered with oleanders, semi-tropical plants and flowers abound. The beaches, parks, and playgrounds are everywhere, with game equipment, lounges, dance floors, picnic areas, baseball fields, tennis courts, golf courses. This Galveston's a real playground.
And Houston folks might recognize the narrator, who was Ron Stone, who was a KHOU at the time, and then he went on to have like a 20-year career at KPRC too. But, well, Sean, 60 years later, has the look of Galveston changed much, in your opinion, from that video?
The surprising thing about this is, for people who've visited here or live here, they're going to see a lot that they recognize.
Yeah.
Guido's, the sign, Guido's is still operating here. It's an institution in Galveston, the restaurant. The Pleasure Pier with the rides, the Ferris wheel. The beaches, of course. That film does a great job of highlighting everything that's attractive about Galveston, that brings thousands and thousands of visitors each summer, each year.
And now I know there also is like a story to the making of this film.
Yes,
can you tell us about that?
Absolutely.
It's a little salty.
So figures in city government were unhappy with the media in the early 1960s. Not a congressperson, a city councilman named Robert Albright, I believe, wrote a letter to the presidents of CBS and NBC and the FCC, as well as James Ridgedale of KHOU, complaining in 1962 of the bad publicity Galveston was receiving in the press and in the media. He was unhappy that they focused on the seaweed that had washed up on the beach that summer. They were unhappy. He was unhappy. So was the mayor. Was unhappy with the press that Galveston received because of Hurricane Carla in 1961. Mayor Theodore Stubbs was the mayor then, and he said that it made it sound like Galveston was the epicenter of this hurricane, when actually the entire coast was affected, not just the city of Galveston. And Mayor Stubbs is quoted as saying to these media figures that Galveston is not a dying city, it still has a lot of life in it. James Ridgedale is the person who produced this video 2 years later in 1964. So I have a feeling, I don't know this for sure, but I have a feeling that these complaints from Galvestonians about the bad press had prompted him to create this very nice production, which highlights a lot of things that are really great about Galveston: the beaches, the oleanders, right, the fishing, and so on. So
and a year after, yeah, and a year after Carla, getting people back to Galveston was even that much more important.
Exactly, and that film was made in 1964. You can't tell that a major hurricane had hit at all. So it is quite amazing, yes.
And Sarah, who's watching, also wants to know, are there any other long-term restaurants that stood the test of time that we see either there or
there
not?
Are quite a few restaurants. The one I can think of off the top of my head is the Original Mexican Cafe, which I believe opened in 1914.
Wow.
Don't quote me on that, but it's an old restaurant. It's in an old house. That's not, I didn't see that in the video or the film, but there are still some old institutions, restaurants, and so on.
Yeah, and I think we see the Hotel Galvez in that footage too, which I know is like a long time Galveston institution too.
That opened in 1911, still standing, still operating as the Hotel Galvez. So yes, absolutely.
And what can you tell us about sort of like the history of Galveston as a tourist destination?
Sure. So from what I can see in our archives collections, the tourism industry started really early. We have photos of bathhouses in the 1880s and the 1890s. This is before airplanes and, a burgeoning middle class that could afford vacations every summer and so on. So even at that time, before the 20th century, Galveston was drawing people to its beaches. I've seen reference a lot to its salubrious climate. It's good for the body, good for the soul. So it had its claim to fame quite early, and then it rebounded quickly after the storm of 1900, which was very destructive. That's, when the Hotel Galvez was constructed shortly after, which was a huge draw for tourists, as well as politicians and celebrities Franklin Roosevelt, I believe, stayed there, Lyndon Johnson as well.
Hmm.
Murdoch's, that's another long institution still going on. That's a souvenir shop on the seawall, beach house, and it goes into the Gulf. It's been destroyed. The structure's been destroyed throughout multiple hurricanes.
Yeah.
They always rebuild it, though,
Always come back.
it always comes back. Yes. So.
Oh dear. Well, if our first film introduced us to Galveston's tourism appeal, this next film highlights the city's booming trade and shipping operations. Let's roll the clip.
A colorful part of Galveston's import trade is the arrival of banana boats. Galveston is the logical discharging port for banana cargoes, which are now being received from Mexico and as far south as Ecuador, because they can be transshipped from Galveston in a much shorter time. A special belt conveyor is used to handle stalks from within the ship to waiting refrigerated cars and trucks. The stalks pass before graders who select the greenest bananas for shipment to the farthest destination. The banana fleet is a picturesque part of the great ocean-going vessels that serve the port of Galveston. Ships from over 90 steamship lines offer regular and dependable service to and from America's port of quickest dispatch. Another of Galveston's industries is the manufacture of nails. Great rolls of wire are loaded on ships in Antwerp, Bremen, Liverpool, or Kobe. Final destination, Galveston. The rolls, called wire rods, are discharged direct into the waiting gondola cars and moved directly over the Wharf Company Terminal Railway to the local nail factory, where the wire is cut and fashioned into wire nails. Ships flying the flags of America's allies enter and clear Galveston every day of the year. American liberties and victories tie up alongside British and French vessels. Liberian tankers move down the harbor and pass outward bound Greek freighters, Argentine bulk loaders, and Dutch cargo ships. Japanese vessels discharge shipments of tea, steel, machinery, plywood, and fishing poles made in Japan. Here is a cargo of Japanese plywood being handled from ship's pole to wharf. Many a home in the Southwest will be more beautiful for the paneled den, finished in plywood imported from Japan through the port of Galveston.
So that segment comes from a 1950s promotional film produced by the Galveston Chamber of Commerce. And so that's the second, very colorful promotional film we've watched already tonight. And I know there are plenty more in the Rosenberg Library's collection. Do you know where the library received them? Were they all from one source or multiple sources?
So I asked the former head of the archive that, Casey Green. He's been at the library since 1984.
Wow.
I thought he would definitely know where we received these videos and films. And he said that they came from various sources in sundry ways. And I think that pretty much sums it up.
Maybe just floated and made their way to the Rosenberg Library over time.
But thinking about it now, we do have a longstanding relationship with the Galveston Chamber of Commerce. We have their records here at the library. We have the collection of one of its presidents, Rosella Wurlitz, Horace Merlin. I imagine that since the library itself had such a close relationship with the chamber, probably a lot of these came through the Galveston Chamber of Commerce.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
How important was Galveston to the Texas economy in the 19th and 20th century?
Completely.
Very.
Completely. Extremely important.
Yeah.
So very early, actually, and it's interesting because many people think of Galveston as a tourist place, which it is. It's also been a very industrial place and a huge, important port. And this started very early. The Mexican government created a port in Galveston in the 1820s. This was at the same time that Stephen F. Austin and others were bringing colonists from the United States into Texas. So at the same time that Austin was forming his colony, the Mexican government was opening a port on Galveston Island. And the figure I saw after the revolution was that in 1839, the port of Galveston had handled $1 million worth of commerce. So that's in 1839. exploded after that, of course, with cotton and a host of other things. That's one thing I'm surprised about this film, is that they mentioned screws, which I had no idea.
They're manufacturing screws in Galveston.
That Galveston was a center of screw manufacture. But cotton was a huge part of the Galveston economy, and of course the Texas economy as well. This is what made Galveston extremely wealthy in the 1890s. Galveston was a huge exporter of grain. There were multiple grain elevators in Galveston. Also sulfur. Sulfur was big on the port as well. So for an island like Galveston, which is, I believe, 2 to 3 miles wide at its widest, to have all that industry as well as the beach and the tourism part is quite amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. Do you know what the main industry is there now?
Definitely tourism with the cruise ships, even on the port side. We do have cruises for people going throughout the Caribbean and Mexico. But there are still port facilities for this industry as well. I can't tell you what the main one is. I believe a lot of cars are shipped through here, I believe, maybe Volkswagen and so on. I'm not exactly certain, but Galveston still does have its industrial facilities. It's changed over time, of course, and more geared towards tourism now, but it's still in existence.
When do you think that shift really started to happen? And like shifting, especially from Galveston to Houston as this sort of center for commerce?
I think definitely in the decades after the storm of 1900. The storm of 1900 is the most devastating natural disaster in United States history. The storm killed between 8,000 to 12,000 people. We won't ever know a complete exact number because it was so devastating at that time. But that definitely set Galveston back. At the time that it struck, the oil industry was beginning to form in Texas, Spindletop. Oil was discovered there shortly after the storm of 1900. So while Galveston was trying to get back on its feet, Houston was in a prime position to overtake it. Because of that, the channel was dredged further, I believe, in the 1910s, which benefited Houston quite a bit. Houston could expand into the huge
There's
city.
Not a limited surface area.
Exactly. It is today. More connected to the railroad. So definitely in a couple of decades after the 1900 storm. That doesn't mean that Galveston completely lost its place. Well into the 20th century, there were still foreign consulates here in Galveston for Italy, for Cuba, and so on. It still was an important center of international commerce into the 1940s, 1950s, but Houston definitely overtook it in those first few years after the storm of 1900.
They saw their opportunity.
Oh, they took it, yes.
But so as we've discussed, Galveston is a city with a very long history, and this 1977 television documentary segment focuses on the rich heritage of its residential neighborhoods. And I wanted to be sure to point out that we're actually going to watch a new higher quality transfer that TAMI made with its brand new scanner that we got this past year. Let's roll the clip.
Galveston really has a fantastic assemblage of architecture, both in terms of major and minor architecture. And the small houses, as well as other similar elements in the community, had been sort of overlooked. The major interest had really been in terms of buildings along the Strand and the larger residential structures. But equally important on a collective basis are the smaller houses, most of which are concentrated in an area south of Broadway, and most of which, or at least those that are remaining, date from the 1870s through the 1900 period, or just prior to the storm. They were built by workmen like draymen, carpenters, harness makers. The little house that I bought was built by a harness maker, and built by and for blacks in many instances. And I think that they sort of fill out the picture, not only architecturally, but socially and economically in terms of the city, both past and present. You can see from looking at early maps of the city that all neighborhoods had at least one corner store, if not quite a few. And they served more than one purpose. Obviously, they served as a a place for which people in a neighborhood bought their various groceries, but they also served as a social gathering place for neighborhoods. And the reason I really find them so interesting is that they continue to serve that function within many of the neighborhoods, or at least the ones that are still operating.
I'm being told that's actually not our new transfer, but we're going to have the new one on the website here pretty soon. So what styles of architecture might visitors encounter around Galveston?
They will encounter a very eclectic group of houses and buildings in different styles. The oldest home on the island is the 1838 Menard House. So that's 1838. That's before Galveston even was founded as a city, I believe. It survived all those hurricanes, all of those storms. It's your sort of traditional plantation style Greek revival mansion. But we have more houses from the 1840s and 1850s. Ashton Villa, which is just across the street from the Rosenberg Library, I believe is the first brick house in Texas. It's from 1859, so pre-Civil War, still standing. A lot of Victorian architecture, especially on the east end of the island. On the downtown, you'll see the cast iron buildings from the 19th century, as well as more contemporary modern houses throughout the island as well. Up to our skyscraper, the Anico building that was built late 1960s, early 1970s. So there's a vast range of different styles in Galveston, and a huge stock of 19th century buildings, as early as 1838 up to 1900, like Ellen said.
And I feel like, unlike a lot of other Texas cities, Galveston has done a lot more to preserve those historic buildings and architecture.
Yes, absolutely. And that's an important point, because the person who produced this film was an Australian who came to Galveston and was shocked to find all of this architecture still in this Gulf island, this is so exposed to the elements. And he had read Howard Barnstone's The Galveston That Was, which is a very well-known book about Galveston architecture. It features the photos of Henri Cartier-Bresson, who came here to photograph some of the buildings. And I credit the Galveston Historical Foundation for their work in preserving a lot of these buildings and historic preservation, as well as Ellen Beasley, who is the person featured in this film. She's a preservationist, an author, as well as my personal friend. And I credit her for pioneering the studies of the buildings and the neighborhoods outside of the downtown area and outside of the wealthier sections of the city. She really showed us that the working class and the African-American neighborhoods were just as rich, as if not richer, in terms of style and use as some of the other buildings that were always heavily featured in the souvenir books that we have in our collection, for example, that featured the mansions and so on.
And then maybe had less trouble getting and raising funds for their preservation too, I'm sure.
Right.
And while we're talking about historic buildings, what about the Rosenberg Library? It's a beautiful historic building. What's its history?
It is. It's a very beautiful building. I'm not an architecture expert, but I've heard it described as late Italian Renaissance, so that's what I'm going with. It opened in 1904, the main building. We now are comprised of two wings, but the main wing opened in 1904, has a terracotta siding, rich, nice wood floors and marble walls, 4 floors. As you said in the introduction, it took over from the Galveston Mercantile Library, which opened in 1871. So that's our claim to as the oldest continuous public library in Texas. In the late 1960s, they decided to build, in addition to the library, which is where I'm sitting today, this is where the archives is housed, which is great. I'm glad that they built extra space for us. But at that time, they had covered a lot of the architectural details from 1904 up. On the 4th floor, we originally had a theater, where people could watch presentations or plays and so on. And they had put a drop ceiling in and covered, the windows and so on. What happened in the past few years is we did a large renovation project where we restored how it appeared in 1904.
Oh,
So we
cool.
have the skylights from 1904, the crown molding and everything. So it's not open to the public yet, the fourth floor museum part. But at some point we will reopen, and I encourage everyone to come and see how the library originally looked and now looks like again.
And who is the Rosenberg that it's named after?
The Rosenberg Library is named after Henry Rosenberg. He was a Swiss immigrant. He came over, I believe, when he was 19 years old, in the 1850s, early 1860s, or maybe before that. He worked his way up. So he started in a dry goods store, and a few years later, bought the dry goods store, then became involved in banking, and like so many other wealthy Galvestonians, in a variety of things, banking, cotton, shipping, and so on, and became a very, very wealthy man. But he was also a great philanthropist. And so what he left in his will, he died in 1893 or 1894, he left a lot of money for different things in Galveston: an orphan's home, a women's home for aged women, which is still standing. He left money for various fountains that are still throughout the city for horses to drink from during the days when everyone were using horses and carriages to get around town, as well as money for a library. And so we still have the original endowment from Henry Rosenberg's will.
Wow.
And we're very thankful that he was such a great benefactor for the city. I can't imagine Galveston without the things that he provided for us.
And Judy, who's watching, was asking, was there any other figure in Galveston that had quite that like philanthropic of a legacy?
There are quite a few people who have legacies, and I would say families like the Kipner family, the Moody family.
Right.
But as far as a single individual, or Mary Moody Northern, who was a great philanthropist as well, and donated a lot of her money. She and Henry Rosenberg, I think, are probably the top two single individuals. Yeah, absolutely.
And we have her endowments collection on the website too, actually.
Okay, yes.
But got both represented. Well, our next film is a real curveball, Sean. I gotta tell you, and I'm not even gonna set it up. We're just gonna play it. So
okay.
Play the clip. And it is silent, so we'll be able to talk over it. So amid the Rosenberg Library's collection of home movies and colorful promotional films was this 35mm Universal Pictures two-reeler called Brother for Sale. And released in 1930, the short stars Lawrence Mckean Jr. as resentful older brother Sonny Jim, who pawns baby brother Frisbee off on an unsuspecting stranger, leading to all kinds of trouble. And TAMI does not have the equipment to digitize 35mm because we don't encounter that format very often. So the Library of Congress actually digitized this short as part of this silent film project. And as far as I know, it has no connection to either Galveston or Texas. So do you know how it ended up at the Rosenberg Library?
No, and I asked you to include this in our segment tonight because I think this is one of the great things about archives and working in an archives is because you never know what you're going to find. We did not know that we had baby for sale in our collection, and I don't know where it came from. And I think it's interesting for a variety of reasons. It's 1930 and it's a silent movie, so it's sort of on that cusp between the silent age and the talkies. And it's a very, very rare film. I looked up some information about it, and on a message board a few years before you all had your program here, people were wondering where these films ended up because there were a series, I believe, of 29 that Lawrence Mckean starred in.
Yeah, there were several he did.
Someone had found stills from one of them that listed the different video or the different titles of the films, but as far as people knew, there were no surviving copies. So when you all digitized these films for us, we discovered we had a copy of one of them. And Lawrence Mckean, I had not heard of him, but he must have been quite a budding star in the 1920s because there was a candy bar named after him.
Yeah.
He unfortunately died in 1933 of a blood disorder, blood poisoning at the age of 8. So Yes, unfortunately, his life's short. Um, but as I previously said, the library opened in 1904. We've been collecting materials ever since we opened. That's well over 100 years worth of collecting activity, and you never know what you're going to find. That could have ended up at the library in 1930 for a children's night on the fourth floor when we had a theater, and now
yeah, it's a great example of you never know what you're going to find, especially I think in institutional collections. And it's also a great example of how, especially with these older silent films, of that, where all copies feel lost, that they just show up in the most random of places. I know some of like Spencer Williams's race films were found in like old movie theaters in New Zealand, and it's like great, and now we have this print that we thought was lost forever.
Yes.
Well, since you didn't know that the Rosenberg Library had this, what was the reaction after seeing the digital transfer?
We were excited, and I think the Library of Congress was excited too, because I think they wanted, it for their silent film archive, because I don't think that, as far as we know, another institution has this. So it's quite a unique find, and it's great. I think it's great for silent film fans, for people interested in Baby Snookums or Sonny Jim. That's the character that Lawrence Mckean played. So it's exciting to share.
It's pretty wild. It was very interesting for me to start watching too. It's a real tone shift from those colorful promotional films.
Yes.
But let's return to Texas with Galveston native and state senator Babe Schwartz. The following television news coverage documents him filling in as governor for the day on February 19th, 1966. Let's roll the clip. This is also silent, so we can talk. So this was apparently it is a long-standing tradition in the Texas legislature, where the president pro tem of the Texas Senate gets the honor of serving as the state's chief executive for at least a day. And do you know much about Babe Schwartz? I know he served in the Texas legislature for some time, I know.
Yes, Babe Schwartz was a native Galvestonian. He was born here in 1926. He was elected to the state Senate in 1959. He was actually elected or selected as the president pro tem in 1965. So he should have become governor for a day that year. He didn't become governor for a day until 1966. He was selected twice, which was a rare thing to happen. He believed he was passed over the first year because he was an advocate of ending these sort of closed room sessions where legislators would hand out appointments to people. He was an advocate of open government, of transparency, of accountability. So he believed he was passed over in 1965, but in 1966 he was reselected as president pro tem, and he became governor for a day. And on that day, he signed two proclamations. One was honoring state employees. The other one was highlighting the needs of those with mental disabilities. That was one of his passions. We have a large collection of his materials here at the library. Before I get to that, I also want to say Babe Schwartz later became famous in the 1970s, 1979, as one of the 12 Killer Bees, a group of Texas state senators who had hid for a few days so that the Senate couldn't reach a quorum and vote on a change to the primaries. That year, Ronald Reagan was running against John Connally of Texas in the Republican presidential primary. The Killer Bees worried that if you had this Republican presidential election on a different day than the regular state primaries for the rest of the political parties, that conservative Texas Democrats would vote in the Republican election and then come back and vote in the Democratic primary and choose conservative Democrats. And they wanted to have it so it was all on one day. You had to make a choice whether to vote as a Republican or as a Democrat, and that way more liberal Democrats could be elected. So that's why they hid for, I believe, 4 days so that the quorum couldn't be reached. They were known as the Killer Bees because Lieutenant Governor Hobby said he never knew when they were going to strike next. So that's, I think that's a great story for Babe Schwartz. But we do have quite a large collection of his records and materials. It's, I believe, a really rich yet underutilized resource. So if I can make my pitch right now, there's anyone who's interested in writing an article or their PhD dissertation, come to the library, because the Schwartz collection has a lot of material on the environment, coastal preservation. That was one thing he advocated for. I think it's a great resource.
You know, and when you've been in the Texas legislature for as long as he was, because it was like he started in the House in 1955.
Yeah, he started
I
the
think.
House before he was elected to the state Senate.
And then Senate, and then he was in the Senate for like a couple decades. So
yeah,
you know, he's gonna have a lot.
yes, yes, absolutely.
A lot of material to go through. Well, we meet another well-known Galvestonian in our next film with acclaimed Hollywood director King Vidor. I looked up how to pronounce his name because there's Vidor, Texas, but that's not named after.
Yes.
King Vidor, recounting his childhood experience of the 1900 hurricane. Let's roll the clip.
We had some friends within about 2 or 3 blocks of the ocean, and we took refuge in their house. And their name was the Boschkes. Boschke, George Boschke, I suppose. And it was a big home, but it was very close to the ocean. And as I remember that toward noon, lunchtime, we were in the kitchen, and I even remember they had apple pie and cheese and for lunch. And we could see the water coming in under the doors, under the kitchen doors. The water was then beginning to come in. It was heavy rains, but the seawater was coming over the town. And then we watched, and they rolled up the rugs, and we walked on rugs. And as the day went on, one of the girls of that household, Boschke girls, they had visitors too, she and I sat on the steps and moved up the steps and watched the furniture in the lower floor begin to float. And things began to bump around and floating. And finally, as the day went on and toward late afternoon and nightfall, everything on the first floor was floating and bumping against the ceiling of the first floor.
Quite the harrowing account. And I know later in his interview he talks about, you know, just the difficulty of getting off an island. You know, there's really only one way in and out, and if
right.
you know that route is obstructed, well then no one can get anywhere.
Yes.
And we've mentioned the 1900 storm already a few times tonight, but for any viewers who might not be familiar, what was the Galveston hurricane of 1900?
The Galveston hurricane of 1900 struck on September 8th. Mm-hmm. It was extremely, extremely damaging to Galveston because, unlike now, when people visit, they're going to see a seawall that protects from storm surges. There was no seawall then. After the storm, the entire city was raised, filled in, seawall constructed. So at that time, Galveston was much closer to sea level. And you had a huge storm surge that came in and just knocked all of these houses that were closer to the beach off their foundations, and all of this debris rushing through, pushing northwards towards the downtown area. Eventually it formed a line of debris that protected some of the houses north of Avenue M or so. The east end was completely obliterated. So entire blocks were just completely obliterated. And as you mentioned afterwards, there was no way really to get off the island. Even before then, there were minimal ways to get up, to the mainland. Right. There was a railroad bridge, and I think a bridge for vehicular traffic opened in the 1890s, but those were destroyed. So I can't even imagine what it was like afterwards with the heat, the bodies. We have quite a large collection of photos from the aftermath of the storm of 1900 where you can see just piles of debris. Since there were no ways of leaving the island, there were a lot of bodies that were on the island. They had started dumping those bodies into the Gulf, but then the waters would bring the bodies back ashore. So then they started creating large mounds of bodies to burn. So I can't even imagine the experience of going through the aftermath, much less the actual storm itself.
How did Galveston change in the years after the storms? We talked about, you mentioned, this building the seawall and raising the island. I remember one of the first times I went to Galveston, I think it was like a field trip in elementary school. I always loved that you could see in some of the historic houses, they'd have like the horse tying like posts outside,
Right.
and you could see that it's like they were only a foot or so out of the concrete now, because it's like they had raised the whole grade of the island now to be higher.
Yes, that's true of Ashton Villa that I mentioned earlier. That's across the street. They had a large fence. We have photos of it, but now the posts are, much shorter
Yeah.
because of the grade raising, we call it. Cemeteries, there are some cemeteries that are now underneath present cemeteries, because if you didn't pay for the tombstone to be raised, it was just completely buried under. So that's one way that Galveston changed, was this huge undertaking, which is extremely impressive, of building the seawall, but also raising the island so it would be higher up. And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of the changes was Galveston lost its place, as an international center for commerce and industry. It shifted more towards Houston, but Galveston reinvented itself as a tourist center even more heavily than it had been before. So this is where you start seeing that shift from industry to tourism in Galveston.
And Dave is asking, we've mentioned a few already, what notable buildings survived the 1900 storm?
Quite a few.
Yeah.
So the blocks closer to the beach were completely destroyed, but the downtown core, there was a lot of damage, of course, but a lot of the buildings are still standing. Famous one is Bishop's Palace, which is owned by the Historical Foundation. You can tour it. It was a private residence at that point, later was purchased by the Archdiocese in the 1920s, and now it's owned by the Historical Foundation. It's a large, beautiful brick home that's still standing. St. Mary's Church, the cathedral that was built in the 1850s, that's still standing. So there's quite a few.
Just incredible. Well, Galveston experienced another major hurricane in 1961 with Carla. This television news special captures residents weathering the storm as it moves inland. Let's roll the clip.
Galveston did not lie within the circle of the eye. There had been no let-up there. And now the wind came screaming from the south instead of the east, harder than ever and with more rain. For the majority of Galvestonians, the endless waiting continued in the shelters. But while it did, there were men fighting hard against the storm outside, in command posts and in the flooded streets.
Dr. Williams is having a team sent over there. That has been taken care of.
Has there been any word from Fort O'Connor?
Unit 4-3, KGBC, come in please, it's 4-2.
Defense, we got a report here that there's a wreck on 27th of Broadway. Roger, copy, that's Red Cross needs transportation.
This is Red Cross Radio signing clear and turning it back to civil defense.
But have you checked with the fire department as far as...
Unit 11, this is 9W1583. We have a bedridden patient, Mrs. Collins, at 3619 Avenue E, 3619 Avenue E, a bedridden patient.
We're going to have you
Go ahead, this is Basin County Control.
I know Carla didn't make landfall in Galveston, but it still caused quite a bit of damage. Where does Carla rank in terms of Galveston's history of hurricanes, would you say?
I would say it's after the storm of 1900. However, because of Hurricane Ike in 2008, for us, still in Galveston, that's probably, talked about more because
It's more recent memory.
More recent memory, but Carla did quite a bit of damage in Galveston, as we can see. I think that's a great clip. The way it was filmed sort of captures that frantic charge that's in the air during a hurricane. If anyone's ever lived through one, will know that that's the electric charge that's in the air. People, their nerves are going, and trying to figure out how to get out or how to survive. So I love that clip for that reason. Carla had made landfall, I believe, the eye closer to Port O'Connor, which is south of here, between here and Corpus Christi. However, that placed Galveston on the dirty side of a hurricane, and that's what caused so much damage to Galveston. There was an F4 tornado that ripped through the city. I believe it came down 23rd Street, which is in a very developed area, turned over houses. So it was extremely destructive, not as destructive in terms of loss of human life like the storm of 1900, because that seawall and so on had created a great protective barrier. But as far as the actual damage to the structures, it was pretty destructive.
I think, didn't like take out the entire pleasure pier.
I believe it did.
I think so. And there was even a hotel that was on a pier that I think was just like totally.
There was one during Alicia in
wiped.
the 80s that was wiped out. The one thing that Carla unfortunately destroyed was the Ursuline Convent and Academy. That was built, I believe, in the 1890s, designed by Nicholas Clayton, who's was a very famous Galveston architect. This place had survived the storm of 1900. It survived the storms in 1909, 1915. There was one in 1943. It was a massive, beautiful structure built for the Ursuline sisters, and they ran a school for girls. But Carla had damaged it. I think that was the final straw, and then they decided to tear it down a year or two after that. And from what I hear interacting with people, that's the one building people wish was still standing in Galveston. How could they tear down the Ursuline Convent because it was so beautiful? We have quite a few photos in our collection and on our website if anyone cares to see. But unfortunately, that building was a victim of Carla, even though it had survived so many other storms.
And so, Galveston has survived so many storms, and we're only gonna, unfortunately, have maybe that many more with climate change. How does the Rosenberg prepare for natural disasters?
Yeah, so the Rosenberg Library has also survived quite a few natural disasters itself. Hurricane Ike in 2008 did a lot of damage because it flooded the first floor of the library. Since 2008, the library has undergone extensive renovations. So the windows are a certain grade for protection. Flood surge doors were installed that should keep out the waters from the outside. The renovations are ongoing to this day. That's part of the fourth floor when we uncovered the architectural details from 1904. That's part of those renovations that have been ongoing since 2008. But the impetus for that was Hurricane Ike, which had flooded the first floor. So many steps have been taken to continue to protect the building and the collections inside.
Well, and our next film captures a far less urgent scene ahead of Hurricane Carla. On the contrary, in this home movie, members of the Moore family calmly watch as swelling waves break over the Galveston seawall. Let's roll with it. Can you help explain why it is so remarkable that the waves are this high? Like, how tall is the seawall? It's like 19 feet tall?
It was about 19 or 20 feet tall. Some parts are lower now because of the built up sand and so on, but it's still a very large structure. So when you see the waves crash over, you can tell like that's a strong surge.
I remember when I saw this footage for the first time, this may be my favorite film from the Rosenberg Library Collection, because I was just awestruck by this footage of they're just playing at the beach with these waves breaking over the seawall as a category 4 hurricane rolls in.
That's the electric charge that's in the air.
It was this shot in particular of the dude just calmly walking into the surf. Got rolled away. But as someone who grew up in Houston, I know that it's a common attitude among people living on the Texas coast. Just be real chill about it, because you've seen the one and seen them all. Has that been your experience?
It has.
Living in Galveston.
I'm not a native Galvestonian. I'm from Michigan. I moved down here 7 years ago to work at the Rosenberg Library. The first real major storm I experienced was Harvey a few years ago. And that's when I noticed, it's very stressful, but at the same time, there's sort of this carnival atmosphere on the island. I stayed here for Harvey. I live close to the seawall, and I remember all of the bars were packed on the seawall. There's a large storm coming in. You're right on the beach, and people are having the time of their life. So there's a variety of emotions you all experience when this is upon you.
And hurricanes are one of the rare natural disasters too, where you have some warning.
Exactly.
So it's like, everyone has their hurricane, sort of go bag. You got your, you took out money, you filled up your car with gas.
Yes,
you're sort of prepared to be,
water, yes.
You're prepared that if you lose power for 2 weeks, like you'll have what you need. Just chill about it.
Right.
But we will close this evening's program with the undisputed gem of the Rosenberg Library Collection, which is rare color footage of the 1931 International Pageant of Pulchritude. And I'll give you some background first. So at first, this movie appeared to be, to us, as if it were black and white, but TAMI archivists determined upon further inspection that the footage was actually captured on Kodacolor, which is a rare color film stock produced by Eastman Kodak. Film laboratories have only been able to recreate the red, yellow, and blue information embedded in the celluloid in the last few years, and most still do not possess the specialized technology required, TAMI included. So TAMI and the Rosenberg Library partnered again to receive a National Film Preservation Foundation grant to decode that color information and restore the film. But enough talk, let's actually watch it. Let's roll the clip. So our audience might even notice the lenticular visual pattern of the footage, which was our biggest clue that this was shot on Kodacolor film stock. And this footage comes from the home movie collection of prominent Galveston businessman George Seeley II. Here we see the pageant contestants modeling swimwear in front of the Seeley home open gates. They were fancy because they had a home that had its own name. What can you tell us about the Seeley family?
So the Seeley family ranks up there with the top Galveston families like the Kempners and the Moody's. And the families, I can't say, well, this is a banking family or this is a cotton family. Kempners were in sugar, but they were so involved with so many different facets of the economy and industry here. So the Seeleys with banking and other things as well. George Seeley II, who I believe is the one who gave this film to us, was one of those wealthy members who gave back to the city. And this is a nice tie into the first film that we showed that mentioned the oleanders, because he's a large reason why Galveston is known as the oleander city. I think he cultivated 64 different variations of the oleander plant and other palms. So that sort of verdant pasture, not pasture, but scene that you see outside open gates is probably, because of George Seeley. He was very big into natural beautification here in the city.
Wow. And I know other parts of this film is him recording oleanders around Galveston too.
Right. So we're thankful for his endeavors to make such a nice atmosphere environment here in Galveston. Here they are at the Galveston Beach Club, which was a nice place in Galveston. This is in 1931, which was the last pageant of Pulchritude in Galveston. The Depression ended things, unfortunately, here. I have to admit, Pulchritude was not part of my vocabulary until I came here.
Yeah, same. And there was Miss Belgium, and Miss Belgium won the 1931. So this was the last year of the pageant of Pulchritude, but do similar summertime traditions continue in Galveston today?
They do. An event that happened after the 1930s was Splash Day. That was really big in the 1950s, 1960s. There was a Miss Splash Day. I'm not sure how that lasted. But then another Bathing Girl review started in 2009, which is very similar to this. Contestants dress up in the old-fashioned 1940s, 1930s type of style. We just had one a few weeks ago, maybe last month. So yes, the bathing pageants are still going strong here in Galveston today.
Wow, that's great. Well, to wrap up, how did the Rosenberg Library use and access its audiovisual resources before digitization, or was it even really possible?
It wasn't. I did ask Casey, our former head, who's been here since 1984, and he said maybe 2 times he had some sort of contraption that played one of the reels. But before then, I think some of them may have been digitized on CD, but nothing to this extent. And definitely, we didn't know about this clip from the Bathing Girl Review or the Library of Congress silent film or anything like that. So TAMI's efforts to digitize this and place it on your all's website was such a great benefit for us. We could finally share these audiovisual collections with both our own customers and researchers here at the library, but people throughout the state and around the world as well.
And relatedly, last question, what value do you see in preserving moving images? From promotional films to television coverage to home movies, the Rosenberg Library Collection's got it all.
It adds such a unique view to the past. One thing that stands out from this reel for me is the Golden Age of the Eye, I believe is the name, the one where Ellen Beasley's talking about the small houses and the corner stores. And there's that clip of the men sitting on the porch of the corner store. You can read about corner stores or houses or Galveston history. You might be able to see photos, but seeing those people chatting, I can just picture the age before people are on their smartphones or air conditioned inside, and they're all getting together in a social atmosphere during a hot summer evening and socializing and talking. These films open us up to that sort of social world that you otherwise don't get if you're just reading documents or looking at static images. Or these color videos from 1931. It's just amazing to see what things look like. This in particular, I don't think we had any images of the Galveston Beach Club until you all digitized this for us. Then Richard Eisenhower, who you've interviewed in the past, found 2 postcards showing the Beach Club for us and donated them to us. So we, that sort of a process where we can expand our collections and better document Galveston's rich history. So
yeah, we believe this is like one of the earliest extant color footage of Texas, and it's funny to me how central Galveston is to that too, because some of the earliest any motion pictures of all of Texas was footage of the 1900 storm. Teams from Thomas Edison came down to film. So it's like how central Galveston is to the history of motion pictures and moving images in Texas too.
Truly cool. King Vidor, as you mentioned, he directed some of the black and white scenes for The Wizard of Oz. Speaking
5-time Academy Award nominee.
Joan Blondell, a famous actress, was one of the contestants in these beauty pageants.
So was Dorothy Lamour. She's Miss New Orleans in this footage that we saw too.
Yeah, so she's in here. So Galveston has many connections to Hollywood and Texas film history. So
it's really special. Well, thank you, Sean. We are so grateful that the Rosenberg Library shared its collection with us and our audience as a contributor to the Texas Film Roundup program. And it was a special privilege to talk to you about a few of those materials tonight.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And if you enjoy learning about these films, please consider sending us a tip. We take donations via texasarchive.org/support-us, or you can text Texas Archive to 44321. Archive Dive is made possible in part with the grant from Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.